Okay, yeah, so my presentation is entitled Mine Waste, Colonial Sovereignty, and the Politics of Devastation. I'm a PhD student at the University of Toronto, and yeah, I'm really happy and thankful to be here to share my ideas with you all. So, on August 4th, 2014, the collapse of the mine waste containment facility at Mount Poly Mine in central British Columbia released 15 million cubic meters of mine waste into nearby waterways and ecosystems. The surge of industrial byproduct buried the entire 10-kilometer stretch of Hazeltine Creek and spewed massive plumes of toxic sludge into Poly and Quesnel lakes. This event was the largest mine waste spill in Canadian history. While mine waste events such as these are a source of anxiety for all those who live through them, they represent a specific form of dispossession for Indigenous peoples whose language, ceremony, and story are connected to place. Due to this relationship to the land, moving away from the contamination is often not a viable option. The end result is the loss of traditional practices and having to live with the harmful effects of mine pollution. In this paper, I examined the devastation of mine waste events to arrive at a clear understanding of how sovereignty operates through the resource sector on Turtle Island and how dispossession in these instances occurs in place. Of particular importance for understanding this dispossession in place is an ontology of mine waste that exceeds normative humanist spatial and temporal scales. Mine waste events are long-lasting, i.e., they exist in ecosystems, food chains, and geological signatures for millennia. They're often imperceptible to our everyday sensory ken, i.e., grass and trees may grow up through the wreckage, but the toxicity still remains. And they are difficult to verify, particularly for those located near the spills, i.e., it takes time and money to prove the social and biological maladies experienced from mine waste. Because of this unique character, politics of mine waste is a politics that rarely traffics in certainties. What insights into the geographies of colonialism can be gained by attending to these opaque and fluid modes of dispossession? How can colonial sovereignty, land title, and struggles over land loss be better understood by examining these instances when dispossession occurs without physical removal? Against the backdrop of the entanglement between the amorphousness of mine waste and the maintenance of systems of colonialism, I make two intertwined arguments. First, I argue, in spite of their incredible violence, these events offer an opportunity for the colonial administration to reassert common sense myths about sovereignty and jurisdiction. Second, coinciding with the recent Supreme Court decisions in BC that speak cogently about the legitimacy of land rights in British Columbia and beyond, I argue that at a moment when images and discussions of the impacts of mine waste have reached a pinnacle in the public imaginary, highlighting the injustices surrounding mine waste events offers a unique opportunity to challenge the state's legitimacy and expose the fraught logic that sustains the political order that grants the colonizing state control over the nation. Mine waste and the politics of devastation. These events that teeter between highly visible and barely visible offer an important opportunity to explore the evolving relationships set in place during colonization that continue to mark the mining sector today. Despite the violent nature of these events, the indeterminable character of mine waste enables the maintenance of colonial sovereignty and the further sedimentation of common sense myths about jurisdiction. Devastating mine waste events that are a result of policies that favor economic growth are spun in such a way that enables the reassertion of sovereignty for the colonial administration. So working from Glenn Coulthard's concept, the politics of recognition, I call this strategy of maintaining colonial sovereignty through profit-driven catastrophes a politics of devastation. Whereas a politics of recognition is about strategies of maintaining control through renewed terms of recognition for the colonized, a politics of devastation describes attempts to redirect unwanted outcomes of capital-led governance. These horrific events are spun in such a way that rather than exposing the truth about irresponsible governance and our current ecological crisis, the result is a further naturalizing of truth claims about sovereignty and jurisdictional authority. No doubt, any government would prefer to maximize extraction without events like this, like Mount Poly, coming to pass. Unfortunately, the laws of physics dictate otherwise. So to better understand the politics of devastation, I break it down into what I see as a three-part process. Creating uncertainty. So most people who live near the Mount Poly spill will tell you what happened was fairly simple. The containment facility here that flowed into the Poly Lakes and Quesnel Lakes was full of wastewater, and they'd been applying for permits to pump water from the containment facility into Quesnel Lake for months, but had been continually denied due to resistance from the communities. So rather than not slowing down production as to not create more wastewater or finding some other solutions, they just continued to pump water into the containment facility until the point of complete failure. So despite what is a clear cause and effect relationship for many, for Christy Clark, the Premier of British Columbia, there is far less certainty. It is still a mystery how it happened, she says. We still need to determine the cause of it, and once we determine the cause of it, it will be much easier to hold people accountable. Distancing from culpability. After flying over the spill, Clark commented on the scale of the event and how she was in awe of the power of nature, the power of water. Her comments align seamlessly with a statement from Bill Bennett, the Minister of Natural Resources. Get up in a helicopter and go look at the avalanches that happen in this province. There are probably 10,000 or 15,000 that happen every single year, doing exactly what happened in Hazeltine Creek. The difference is that snow melts, but you're left with exactly the same. The strategy here is clear. Create uncertainty and distance from culpability by framing the industrial disaster as natural and unavoidable. So the third part of this politics of devastation is reasserting jurisdiction and sovereign control. So another part of my research Another part of my research examines a waste event at Pinchy Lake Mine, located in Carrier Traditional Territory in central BC. Between the periods of 1940 and 1975, the Cominco Mining Corporation, now Teck, engaged in the extraction of metallic mercury at the site, at which time much of the mine tailings were deposited directly into the lake. And so yeah, here's a picture of the historic mining operations where a lot of mercury mine tailings, which is hugely toxic, were just dumped right into the lake. In 2004, there was a tailings pond failure, just a smaller one, but it sparked the full-scale cleanup of this mine site by Teck, the mining company. So through a process of cleaning up these sites, Teck has presented themselves as the benevolent caretakers of the people and the land. Yeah, and you can just see in those pictures where the dike just collapsed and allowed all that pond of tailings to dump into the lake. So yeah, Teck has presented themselves as the benevolent caretakers of the people and the land. This is evident in their 2015 report, Decommissioning and Remediation of the Pinchy Lake Mine, where they list among their main objectives being to ensure no unacceptable risks for humans and wildlife, and to maintain traditional land use by First Nations. By granting First Nations access to their land, to their own land, the corporation, operating through state-led political and legal frameworks, reinscribes their role as legitimate caretakers of the land. However, given the reports that up to 99% of the nearby community experiences the effects of mercury exposure, these objectives are laughable, even as they do powerful work in maintaining notions of sovereignty. Even more perplexing, in 2012, Teck was awarded the Jake Macdonald Mine Reclamation Award by the BC Committee on Reclamation for their outstanding reclamation achievements. What I find fascinating about this example is not simply how catastrophic events can be redirected to reassert patriarchal control, but what it tells us about the employment of sovereign power. Examining the institutions that make up the committee that created the award, it is apparent that the colonial administration is not simply government or government and industry, but an assemblage of actors and institutions that benefit from reproducing what Sarah Hunt refers to as colonial-scapes, nested rationales of colonization that serve shifting colonial priorities. Working together, this self-reinforcing assemblage of institutions and actors are central in understanding the processes through which ideas of sovereignty are naturalized. Unearthing the limits of the current political order. To read these events as simply an overt assault or an exercise of brute force would be to misinterpret this complex system that enables the exercising of unquestioned authority over the polity. As Mark Rifkin reminds us, the citation of sovereignty is less a confident and untroubled form of control than a restless performance in which the failure to find a normative foundation of jurisdiction remains a nagging source of anxiety. It is from here, then, that I suggest that due to an important double movement, our current moment represents a unique opportunity to expose the fraught logic that grants the colonizing state superintendent control over the nation. On the one hand, with the increased visibility through media reports on the immense scale and frequency of these waste events, the full cost of capital-driven modes of governance are becoming increasingly visible to the public. And so that was in November. Bento Rodriguez mine dam collapse that completely wiped out a community located about 5 kilometers from it, and slowly migrated down the river valley for almost a week until it was deposited in the Atlantic Ocean. So it's kind of through media we could really see the slow process, the slow movement of this devastation from this mine waste event. And then, of course, a year earlier at Mount Poly, the biggest mine waste event in Canadian history. The second part of this double movement is a groundswell of legal recognition of Aboriginal title. Most notably in the Canadian context is a 2014 Socotan Supreme Court of Canada decision that unanimously recognized the right of the Socotan people to own, control, and enjoy the benefits of the land at the heart of their traditional territory. These legal decisions do important work in exposing the fraught tautological justifications that informs common sense assumptions about national sovereignty. When brought together under the same critical lens, catastrophic assaults brought on by four capital legal and political formations on territory that is increasingly recognized as belonging to First Nations groups lays bare the fundamentally circular and self-validating, as well as anxious and fraught performance that grounds the legitimacy of state rule. Better understanding these mass waste events and the assault they represent on Indigenous lands and peoples offers important moments of rupture for the self-assuring logic of sovereignty. It does so by exposing the logical incoherence of this system and the absurdity of this political order that privileges capital and poisons those people and lands it claims to care for. My hopes are that in better understanding how colonial systems operate through mine waste spills and how landscapes are recoded through these events, that we can more clearly understand the context that enable and sustain these events. By placing these devastating events aside clarion calls against the legitimacy of colonial sovereignty, we gain a more informed foundation to better understand the processes that obscure these events and their less visible, less spectacular, long-standing violence. Those elements that a politics of devastation attempts to include. This paper then is a call to remember the devastation, to resist the illusion and occlusion put forward through myths of sovereign power. Thanks.
So we have about 3 minutes, so maybe 1 or 2 questions.
Yeah, I'm actually sort of in the process of doing, like, I've done initial sort of field work, and so this emerges sort of just like through an analysis of media work and just trying to understand the context. So the field research will take place next year and a little bit this year. So for me, the story is sort of just gradually unfolding. Yeah.
Maybe 1 more question if there's one.
Thank you. That was a really great presentation. I wondered if, I don't know if this is something you figure out more after doing field work, but I wondered if you could maybe speak more to what kinds of local resistance there are to these things, or reactions, right, after they happen.
Yeah. And this is, I've been careful not to include too much information about the First Nations group that I'll be working with in Central BC, because I haven't, although we've met and talked about these things, I haven't got formal approval to discuss my results. But yeah, I think that there's a bit of a, yeah, there has been a lot of resistance, and the resistance has led this story in a lot of ways. So yeah, I think that'll play a central